Snow whispered across the prairie like an old secret, quiet, persistent, and cruel in its coldness. The wind carried no mercy, only the soft shriek of winter moving through bare trees and brittle grass. Beneath that vast, pewter sky, a woman moved alone, her figure small against the endless white. She walked as if remembering how, each step stiff, her limbs uncertain. Her dress, once burgundy, hung heavy and torn, soaked at the hem with melting snow. Mud clung to its folds like bruises. Her shawl, thin and frayed, fluttered around her shoulders, a poor shield against the biting air. Her cheeks, wind-burned and pale, held the echo of beauty, something quiet, worn, but not erased. Her breath came ragged, more memory than rhythm, and the frost clung to the strands of her dark hair like cobwebs spun from sorrow. She didn't know where the trail would lead, only that the past lay behind, buried with the child she never got to name. The sound came suddenly, small footsteps behind her, crunching over frozen earth. She turned, startled, her eyes hollow and red-rimmed. A little girl stood there, maybe 7, wrapped in a coat clearly sewn from leftover fabric. One sleeve was too long. Her boots didn't match. But her posture held something ancient, like she'd been carrying more than her age would allow. The woman opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. The girl didn't wait for them. "Please don't cry, ma'am," the girl said softly, holding something in her mittened hand. A dried prairie flower, brown but whole. "My daddy knows how to embrace sorrow." The woman blinked, as if unsure she'd heard right. The child took a step forward and reached out, her small fingers curling around the woman's. Her touch was warm and impossible, startling kind of warmth. "Come on," she whispered. "It's cold out here." The woman let herself be led. Perhaps because the child's hand felt steadier than her own legs. Perhaps because something in her had finally bent too far to carry itself anymore. The cabin came into view after the trees thickened, tucked deep into a dip of land where snow had softened into slush. Smoke drifted from the chimney in a slow, winding line. A horse stood tied beneath the slanted overhang of a nearby shed, its breath fogging the air. The child didn't knock. She opened the door with a push of her shoulder, her grip never leaving the woman's fingers. Inside, the world shifted. Heat bloomed from a stone hearth where flames danced low and steady. The scent of something simmering hung in the air, onions, salt, broth, warmth. And then the man. He stood at the far end of the room, as if he'd been waiting. 30, maybe. His face was rough with a week's worth of beard, jaw shadowed, eyes darker than coal but quieter too. He wore a plain shirt and trousers stained with earth and with dust. His boots were near the door, snow melting off them. He looked at the woman for only a second. Not with alarm. Not with pity. Just a long, silent understanding that made her want to look away. She tried to speak, some apology, some excuse, but the words stuck in her throat like splinters. The man didn't ask questions. He simply stepped aside and gestured with a slow tilt of his head toward the fire. She moved as if dreaming. The warmth struck her too fast, dizzying. Her legs gave out before she reached the chair, and she sank to her knees on the worn rug, her hands outstretched toward the flames. She didn't cry. Not then. Her tears had frozen too deep to thaw so quickly. The little girl fetched a wool blanket and draped it around her shoulders. Then curled up beside her without a word, a doll clasped against her chest. The man returned to the iron stove and stirred the pot with a wooden ladle. The only sound was the crackling of fire and the soft sigh of the wind pressing against the cabin walls. Time passed like a slow river. When he brought her a bowl of stew, she tried to lift it but her hands trembled too much. The girl steadied the bowl for her, and she took a spoonful. It burned her tongue, but she didn't stop. They didn't speak, any of them. After she finished, she wrapped the blanket tighter and leaned back against the rocking chair behind her. Her breath had steadied. Her bones still ached, but inside her chest, something loosened. The man knelt nearby, setting another log into the fire. She looked at him through the flickering light. Her voice came in a rasp, dry and cracked. "I don't want to be a burden." His eyes met hers, not sharp, not soft, just still. "You're not," he said. That was all. And it was enough. The snow fell through the night like memory, silent, unrelenting, soft. She dreamed of a cabin where no one raised their voice. Of a child who touched her hand without suspicion. Of a man who built warmth without demanding anything in return. And when she woke, she didn't remember where she was at first. But she remembered the feeling. A quiet safety. The girl was already awake, humming faintly, brushing the doll's tangled hair with her fingers. The man was outside, chopping wood, the thud of axe against bark echoing like a heartbeat. The woman sat up, pulling the blanket around her like new skin. She still didn't know their names. But names weren't what she'd needed. What she needed was what she had found here, silence without coldness. Kindness without question. And fire that stayed lit, even through the longest storm. She rose slowly, as if testing whether she could still stand tall. She could. And she would stay, for now. Not because she had nowhere else to go. But because for the first time in years, somewhere had invited her in without asking who she used to be. And that, maybe, was how healing begins. In small, quiet rooms. With warm bowls of stew. And a child's hand that says, "You can rest here." The snow stayed longer than expected that year, draping the valley in silence. Days passed in a slow rhythm, the kind that didn't ask for plans or names, only presence. The woman stayed. At first, because the cold forbade travel. But soon, for reasons she hadn't yet dared to name. Each morning she woke beneath a hand-stitched quilt in the corner bed, warmed by the fire that never went out. The little girl always rose before her, feeding chickens and brushing the old mule without needing to be told. She was quiet but not withdrawn, always watching, listening, moving with a kind of solemn joy that children only carry after learning loss early. The woman found herself mirroring that quiet. She swept the cabin floor. Mended buttons. Repaired the child's doll with a piece of thread left in the corner drawer. Not because anyone asked, but because her hands needed to remember they were still capable of care. The cowboy spoke little. He left each morning with the rising sun, riding out with a leather satchel and returning just as the day turned gold. He brought back chopped wood, game, a bolt of faded cloth once. His steps were steady, his voice low. She began to understand his presence less by what he said and more by what he didn't need to. Some days, they sat across from each other at the table while the child drew with charcoal on scraps of paper. The woman noticed how he mended things without hurry, the saddles, boots, even a broken chair leg. His hands were large, calloused, deliberate. He moved like someone used to being relied on. One evening, after dinner, she sat by the fire while the child slept near the hearth, curled like a kitten. The man was patching a torn sleeve by lantern light, the needle delicate in his strong hands. She spoke first, voice soft but steady. "I was 22 when I married." He didn't look up, but his stitching paused. He was kind, at first. A good man. He drowned in spring runoff trying to save a cousin's horse. They never found the body, only the hat. She didn't cry, not then. Her voice was too dry. "His family never liked me. They blamed me for his death, though I'd stayed behind that day. They said I brought bad luck. That I was cursed for not giving them a grandchild." She looked at the fire, eyes catching the flicker. "There was a child. Stillborn. I buried it myself. They never knew." Silence sat between them, but not the kind that wounds. The kind that receives. The cowboy set the needle down gently and leaned back. "People forget that grief isn't loud," he said. "Sometimes it just lingers. Quiet. Like smoke you can't wash out of your clothes." She looked at him then. Really looked. The weight under his eyes. The way his jaw clenched when he remembered to breathe. "Your wife?" she asked. He nodded once. "She passed giving birth to her." He tilted his head toward the sleeping girl. "That was the last time I heard her voice." The fire snapped gently. "I didn't think I'd raise a daughter," he added. "But here we are." She watched the rise and fall of the child's breath. The soft open hands of sleep. "You've done well," she said. He didn't answer, but his lips twitched slightly, like a man not used to compliments but trying to hold on to one. The next day, the woman mended a curtain without being asked. Then she cleaned the shelves. She sang under her breath, an old hymn her mother used to hum while baking. It startled her when she heard it. At lunch, the girl tugged at her hand. "Can you teach me that song?" The woman smiled without showing teeth. "Maybe tomorrow." That night, she sewed a button on the man's coat. When she handed it to him, he said thank you like it cost him something, but also like it meant something. One evening, the girl insisted they all play her made-up card game, where no one truly wins and the only rule is to smile when you lose. The woman laughed, really laughed, and the sound made the man glance up as if he'd heard a bird return too early for spring. They didn't speak of what passed between them. But it was there, unfolding quietly like thaw beneath snow. Then came the visitor. Late morning, the knock sounded, sharp and unfamiliar. The cowboy opened the door to find a woman in her 50s, wearing a fur shawl and a nose that tilted upward like it resented weather. She brought with her a son, tall and slouched, with eyes too hungry for manners. They were neighbors, barely. Ranchers from the next ridge, drawn by rumor and curiosity. "Word gets out," the older woman said as she stepped inside without being invited. "We heard you had company." The cowboy said nothing, simply moved aside with that same quiet dignity that didn't welcome but didn't protest either. The woman stiffened when the older lady looked her over. "You've been through some weather, haven't you?" she said with a tone dipped in something sweet and sour. The son said nothing but let his eyes linger too long. The cowboy stood near the stove, arms crossed, saying little. But his gaze sharpened. When the older woman made a joke about folks taking in strays, the cowboy spoke. "This house isn't open for judgment." His voice wasn't raised, but it was firm, like the sky before a storm. The visitors didn't stay long after that. When they left, the door closed behind them with a heavy thud. The woman didn't speak for a while. She stirred the pot on the stove with shaking hands. "Thank you," she whispered eventually. He met her eyes. "You don't owe me that." "I do." He didn't press. Only said, gently, "You're safe here." That night, she found herself standing outside under the stars. The wind had quieted. The trees stood still. He joined her, wrapped in a blanket, his breath misting beside hers. The moon hung low and gold. "You could leave tomorrow," he said. "You owe me nothing." "I know." She looked at him, his face caught in half-light. "But I don't want to." He didn't answer. Just looked back at her as if something in his chest had loosened. In the stillness, they stood side by side, not touching, not speaking, just breathing the same air. And though neither of them said it, something new had begun. Not love, not yet. But something braver. The beginning of staying. The girl watched them from the window, face lit by firelight. She didn't smile. Just nodded, as if she'd known all along that this moment would come. Inside the cabin, the air held a quiet warmth. Not from the fire. From the way silence, finally, had begun to shelter them all. The thaw began subtly. Not with a grand melt, but with the soft sound of dripping water from the eaves, like the cabin itself was beginning to weep the weight of winter away. Snow receded from the roots of the trees, unveiling patches of brown earth and bent grass pressed flat by months of silence. She noticed the change first in the air. The cold still lingered, but the wind had lost its bite. In its place came the faintest scent of pine and something green stirring beneath the soil. One morning, the girl tugged her hand toward the small clearing behind the cabin. The ground was damp and half-frozen, but the child knelt without hesitation, digging with a stick. The woman crouched beside her, her knees stiff, palms pressed into the cold. The girl grinned and held up a small bundle of bulbs, still curled and sleeping. "Mama used to say things still grow, even when we can't see them," she said softly, brushing dirt from her hands. Then she pressed one bulb into the earth, gently, like it might bruise. The woman touched the soil too, her fingers trembling slightly. It had been so long since she'd planted anything, even hope. But she followed the girl's lead, pressing her own bulb beside the child's. Not speaking, just breathing in the soft promise of maybe. The cowboy watched them from a distance, axe balanced against one shoulder, his frame outlined by sunlight. He didn't interrupt. Just nodded once when she looked up and met his eyes. Later, she found herself humming again, unconsciously. The song came easier this time. Her voice cracked, but she let it. She was learning not to apologize for things that still hurt. The child joined in, off-key and certain, her voice filling the room with a crooked kind of joy. The man smiled as he listened from his place near the stove, and for the first time, the woman saw him not as silent or grieving, but as someone waiting, patiently, for something to come back to life. The days lengthened. She opened the windows to let in the breeze. Rewashed the curtains, scrubbed the floor, rethreaded old quilts. It was not about earning her stay. It was about making space for breath again. And he began to sit closer. At night, he'd sip coffee at the table while she embroidered, both of them watching the child draw horses with wild manes and crooked legs. Sometimes they spoke. About ordinary things. The price of flour. Which trees needed felling come summer. Whether the chickens were laying enough to justify a trip to town. But beneath those words lived something deeper. A quiet acknowledgement. A rhythm. A knowing. One afternoon, a pair of sparrows built a nest in the rafters. The child named them, chattering on about which was the mama and which was the papa. The woman listened with half a smile, eyes soft. "You've changed things," the man said later that evening, quietly. She was wiping dishes. She paused. "What do you mean?" He nodded toward the girl, who was humming to herself while brushing the doll's hair. "She sings again." She didn't know what to say. So she dried the last plate and set it down carefully, as if the moment itself might shatter if she moved too fast. When the next visitor came, it was someone from farther out, an older man who traded pelts and gossip. He stopped by for coffee and conversation, and lingered too long, letting his eyes settle where they didn't belong. She stood straighter then, her spine a blade of defiance, and the cowboy noticed. He moved between her and the trader like it was nothing, blocking the line of sight without a word. His stance said enough. The man left quickly, muttering about weather and women. The cowboy watched until he disappeared into the trees. When he returned inside, he didn't speak. Just looked at her. She nodded once, a silent thank you. That night, the girl insisted they play her card game again. The woman dealt the cards with a smile that reached all the way into her eyes. The man lost 3 rounds and laughed, a low, rusty sound like a creek thawing. After the girl fell asleep, the woman stayed by the fire. He joined her, sitting so close their shoulders nearly touched. You ever think about staying? He asked after a while, not looking at her. She didn't answer immediately. Her hands rested on her knees, still and quiet. Sometimes, she said. And then, always. The fire crackled. Shadows moved across the floor like forgotten songs. He reached over, not quickly, not hesitantly either, and gently took her hand. Not possessively. Just enough to say, I see you. I'm here. She let him. Let the warmth from his fingers seep into hers, slow and steady. I didn't think I'd feel this again, she whispered. Neither did I. And they sat like that, side by side, while the fire burned low, and the snow outside finished melting into the earth. The next morning, the child ran out to the garden patch and shouted loud enough to wake the valley. The flowers had sprouted, thin green shoots poking up like brave little soldiers. The woman ran to see, breathless, heart-thudding, and knelt in the dirt with her skirts bunched around her knees. She touched the shoot with reverence. They bloomed, she said, as if surprised. The girl beamed. You helped. The cowboy came out, boots half-laced, and stood beside them. He didn't speak. Just looked down at the patch of color rising from the mud. Then he looked at her. There was no need for words. That afternoon, the woman baked bread with the child beside her, covered in flour. The man chopped wood out back, whistling under his breath. And inside the cabin, something took root deeper than bulbs in spring soil. It was not yet love. But it was how love begins. In quiet spaces. In ordinary kindnesses. In the brave act of choosing to stay. Spring brought more than flowers. It brought roads that softened into mud and rumors that rode in on hooves. The woman had begun to laugh freely now, her shoulders no longer curled as though expecting the world to strike. Her days found purpose in bread dough, in mending sleeves, in teaching the child to braid. Her eyes no longer scanned the tree-line for something terrible approaching. Until it did. They arrived just after noon, 2 men on horseback, wide-shouldered and sharp-eyed. Their coats were expensive, dusty with travel, and their faces familiar in the worst way. She stepped out of the cabin the moment she heard the second horse whinny. Her blood ran colder than the last frost. She knew those profiles, that crooked smile on the younger one, the pinched mouth of the elder. Her late husband's brothers. The cowboy came from the shed, wiping his hands on a rag, body coiled without panic. He looked once at her, read her face, and walked to stand beside her. The elder dismounted first. His voice held mock surprise. Didn't expect to find you out here, though I suppose it suits you. Dirt and silence. She didn't move. She didn't speak. The younger brother circled his horse lazily, looking over the cabin like a man appraising livestock. We've come to collect her, the elder said flatly. Families owed some answers. You disowned me, she replied. Your mother called me a curse. You left with things that weren't yours. My brother's rifle. His ring. The mule. The mule was starving, she said quietly. I took nothing that wasn't mine. The younger brother dismounted and stepped closer. The cowboy shifted. His body placed itself between them like a wall. The elder brother's eyes narrowed. And who's this? Her new keeper? The cowboy said nothing. His silence carried more weight than argument. This land's not yours, the younger said. You're just squatting here, hiding what doesn't belong to you. The girl appeared in the doorway, eyes wide, arms wrapped around her doll. The woman took a step forward, shielding her instinctively. You've made your lives off cruelty, she said. Off deciding who's worth keeping. But I'm done being something you can throw out or drag back when convenient. The younger reached for her wrist. It was quick, a snap of impulse. But the cowboy was quicker. He stepped forward, took the man's arm, not with rage, but with calm, firm power, and removed it from her like someone brushing snow from a shoulder. That's enough, he said. His voice low. Solid as wood. The brothers looked at him, saw what was behind his eyes, and stepped back. You'll regret this, the elder hissed. Already did, the cowboy answered. Then closed the door. The sound echoed in the silence that followed. Inside, the woman sank into a chair, shaking. The girl crawled into her lap, her arms tight around her neck. I'm sorry, she whispered into the child's hair. I'm so sorry. You don't have to be, the cowboy said from the shadows. Not here. That night, she packed her things. Not out of fear, but to offer freedom. I can't bring this to your door, she said. I won't. He watched her for a long moment, then walked over and took the bag gently from her hands. This cabin was built for wind and snow. It can weather cruel men too. She shook her head, eyes glossy. I don't want to stay because I'm scared. Then don't, he said. Stay because you're not. She stood still, uncertain. You don't need to fix anything to be wanted, he added. Some people will see your softness and call it weakness. But it's the bravest thing I've ever seen. The bag slipped from her grip. In the quiet that followed, the girl stepped between them, lifted her arms toward the woman. I don't want you to go. And neither do I, the man said, barely audible. So she stayed. Spring came fully the next morning. The snow was gone, replaced by damp soil and birdsong. The bulbs they had planted broke through the earth in bursts of color, yellow, violet, pale pink. The woman knelt beside them, brushing dirt from the petals with fingers that trembled for a new reason. The girl crouched beside her, humming. The cowboy brought a fresh pot of coffee out onto the stoop, watched them in silence. His gaze never left the woman's face. She looked up. "They're beautiful," she said. "So are you." It was the first time he'd said anything like that. The words didn't startle her. They landed gently, like something she already believed, but hadn't dared say aloud. Later, at the table, the girl asked if they could all have the same last name. "Just in case," she added, "someone else comes asking questions." The woman smiled, cheeks flushed. "Maybe someday," she said. The cowboy reached across the table and took her hand. "Or maybe today." She looked at him, startled. "It doesn't need to be grand," he said. "Just true." She laughed softly, a sound like water over stones. "Then yes," she said. The girl clapped so loud the cabin seemed to echo with it. There was no preacher. No ring. Just a promise spoken quietly in the corner of a cabin that had already held more truth than most churches. They shared bread, laughter, the stillness of the land. They let the wind carry off the names that had hurt them and planted new ones in the space left behind. Outside, the flowers bloomed without apology. And somewhere in the trees, the last frost gave way to green. The valley didn't cheer. It simply breathed, alive and whole. Sometimes, beginnings don't look like grand gestures. They look like staying. Like standing in front of someone who once flinched at love, and choosing not to leave. They looked at one another across the table, man, woman, child, and knew something sacred had been made not with noise, but with stillness. The world would keep turning. The past would not rewrite itself. But this cabin, these hands, this life, were now theirs. So if ever you find yourself lost in winter, remember this. Somewhere, there's a child's hand waiting to guide you. A man who doesn't need to speak to understand. And a woman who rose from silence and bloomed. That, too, is love. And it lives where sorrow once stood.